Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. Let's start our video with the story in which the horrible sister sold the van to our OP and then demanded it back and went to the police. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you're new here and turn on notifications so you don't miss a new video every single day. Here we go. Entitled sister throws a fit over my van. After moving back from cross country, I and my 3 kids were either taking the bus or paying for rides from family and friends. My sister had a 15-ish-year-old full-size van that she offers to me for $500. I jumped on this offer as I was working the late shift and wouldn't need to bother anyone for a ride 8 miles both ways. After getting the van legal and insured, I was able to drive it for 3 to 4 months. Then the front end axle breaks while I'm driving it. I was back to square one because getting it fixed would cost around $3,000 to $4,000 and I was living paycheck to paycheck. Since I lived in an apartment complex, I had to get it off the property within 30 days. I ended up calling a friend who scraps the van and hauls it off. My sister's driving by as they're loading it. I was at work and get a call from the sheriff's department saying my sister's accusing me of stealing her van. After I get back to my apartment, I get the van title and go to the police station where my sis is waiting. I also call my friend that hauled off the van. The sheriff starts in on me and I just hand him the van title and the bill of sale. My friend then shows him the scrap sale papers and the VIN photo, which proves I'm in the clear. Needless to say, my dear sister was threatened with arrest for wasting police time and false accusations. As I stated in the other post, I've been NC with her for almost 6 years. I don't miss her drama either. I honestly don't know. If she wanted it back, she should have said something. Seeing as it was broken down, I wouldn't think she'd want it. I refused to speak to her afterwards, and she still maintains to family that I sold her van. Does your sister have a toddler mentality? What's mine is mine. What's yours is mine. If I see it, it's mine. If it was once mine, it's mine. And our second story. They stole my Rolex. I need to be compensated for it. Okay, I'm an intern at the moment, and this happened to my supervisor, not me. So as the solicitor in a rural southern county in the U.S., my boss has to deal with a number of interesting people. There was one case she worked on where a string of robberies occurred. Now, the defendant was convicted and ordered to pay restitution. Now, one of the victims had estimated the majority of the items stolen, a TV, lawnmower, some tools, etc., is valued at $2,500 total, with the exception of an heirloom Rolex, which they were insistent they owned and was worth $10,000. Now, this victim had been on the other side of the court case as a defendant many times, mostly related to illegal substances. Now, they had absolutely no proof they even owned this watch or that the watch even existed. So my boss tried explaining it to them without proof. There's no way the judge is going to order the defendant to pay that large of an amount back to them. So they go to the sentencing and the judge orders the defendant to pay the victim the $2,500. Now the victim in open court addresses the judge and says, "What about my Rolex? It's a family heirloom worth $10,000 and $2,500 barely covers the other items. The defendant needs to pay me for everything and for my time too. I deserve $15,000 for all this bullcrap." The judge isn't very amused, but does his job and informs the victim that they need to speak to the prosecutor to schedule a restitution hearing within 90 days to establish the value of the items lost, and he'll make sure the defendant is ordered to pay what's owed. So the victim calls in the next day demanding that my boss set up the hearing as soon as possible. Now, my boss is pretty busy as they're understaffed in a large county and suggests they schedule for the end of the month so they, the victim and my boss, have time to gather proof of current value of the items lost. But nope, they were not having it. Screamed the prosecutor was incompetent and that the only reason they're getting money is because the judge does his job and that they won the case because the defendant pled guilty, and if it had gone to trial, my boss would have let them walk, and that they will bring the proof themselves, and that my boss was useless and all sort of nonsense and bad words thrown in. So my boss relents and says the earliest that it can be done is next week, but the prosecutor's office would need the victim to come in today to sign some paperwork and advises them that they can have their own independent attorney present to make sure everything is understood. The victim comes down to the courthouse and my boss advises them of their rights to an independent attorney, that the burden of proof of value was on them, and just generally goes over everything once more. They sign the acknowledgement form and take a copy home. My boss then has to do everything on rush to make sure the hearing is set on the judge's docket and gets the file they have from law enforcement ready to present. So comes court day, and the victim goes before the judge and says the same thing as before, that they're due more than $2,500, that the Rolex was an invaluable family heirloom worth at least $10,000, maybe more, and that they deserve compensation for their time and suffering and should be awarded $15,000. The judge then asks for proof of value, and lo and behold, the victim has no real proof. They have a printed and stapled owner's manual to the TV they claim they own, and a remote, new, worth $800, some receipts from Advanced Auto for the tools, about $150 new, a picture of them on the porch of the house where the break-in occurred, with a rusted-out riding mower in the background, and a printed page from the internet of the mower new, value $1,200 new, and a handwritten document describing the Rolex and the ownership status belonging to the victim, all signed by their grandfather, and a picture printed from the internet of the alleged $10,000 watch. The defense attorney got to go next and had proof that the mower was still right where it was in the picture, and argued that the documentation of the TV and watch weren't real evidence of ownership or current worth, and that the receipts from Advance Auto, only a few items held any value after purchase. The judge looked at the evidence and orders restitution to be paid $300 for the broken window that was in the prosecutor's report, and for a few of the tools off the Advance Auto receipts, but denied any further payment as none of the victim's claims legit. This enraged the victim, and they freaked out in court, screaming at the judge and throwing their chair and trying to flip the desk. The judge is not happy, orders them in contempt, and has the bailiff come remove them from the courthouse and orders a night in jail. At the jail, they're searched and find a few grams of illegal substances. This was a violation of their parole, and they ended up serving time for their suspended sentence. About 2 years total. Sometimes you have to know when to fold your hand and stop bluffing. And our next story. Dispute over wall height with creeper neighbor. So a few years ago, my mom had just bought this house. Context, it's an all-female house, mom, older sister, me, and our 2 dogs. And all these instances happened the 5 years we were there. We noticed that the lowermost part of the back wall was a little short, and we were worried about our dogs jumping the fence. So we got permission from the neighbors to raise it a little. By a little, they meant 1 brick laid flat. We wanted 5, but struggled to get them to 2, because he didn't want to ruin his view. There was a gigantic mango tree there, so I don't know what view he was whining about. After this, he would jump the fence and help himself to our mangoes. Now, normally we'd be very accommodating, but trespassing and helping yourself is a big no from us. He ended up having his grandchildren sneakily pick the mangoes, but we ended up getting water guns and filling them with colored water. That was a pain to wash out of clothes and stained if left on the skin too long, and sprayed them every time we saw them. He would also pop his head over the fence to have a chat whenever he thought he heard us, even after warning him many times we weren't okay with him doing this, and it was highly inappropriate. Remember, all-female house. That night, Mom came home and gave him his last warning before we called the cops, if he did that again. He was lucky we hadn't already called the cops on his sorry butt. We also told him my sister had a deadly fish/shellfish allergy, and could he please stop putting his crab pot on the fence between our 2 properties. When he didn't stop, I waited till everyone was out, I cut the rope, and threw out a very expensive-looking crab pot. You think that's the petty revenge part? Just wait. After all this, Mom had enough, went F your view, and planted bamboo that grew to about 2 stories tall. And our last story. Always respect your rent agreement. 3 years ago, I was in college studying business with a minor in photography. I had aspirations of becoming a freelance photographer. While attending college, I was renting the basement of a house from a woman who lived near the college. She and I got along great up until this dispute. The basement of this house had an extra room that I wasn't using. It was a small room, but big enough. I had decided to turn it into a home studio, so I set up my studio lighting set and backdrop and began advertising my services. I was working for free as I wanted to build a portfolio, and I figured that was the best way to attract people who would let me use their photos. Basically, the deal was, I'll take your photo with professional equipment free of charge as long as you sign a contract that says I can include the photo in my portfolio. Landlady eventually started to notice that I had guests a few times a week and that it was rarely the same people more than once. So she asks, "What's that about?" Fair enough, I explain it to her, and suddenly she flips her lid, says I'm in violation of my contract because the rent agreement says that I'm not allowed to run a business from the basement. She tells me if I don't tear down the studio and stop immediately, she'll evict me. One of my friends at the college is studying law because her father owns a small firm and she wants to inherit the business. So I brought the rent agreement to her father to make my case. It says I can't run a business, but a free service is not a business. He agrees and says he'll see what he can do for me. In his research, he finds out that she is actually renting the whole house from someone else and is subletting to me. My rent agreement has a clause that prohibits subletting, and while he didn't have a copy of the agreement she signed with the actual owner, he figures hers probably did too. He eventually managed to find out who the actual owner of the house is and lets me know. Now, keep in mind, I don't actually know whether she's prohibited from subletting, so I would have no reason to avoid contacting him. I sent him an email asking for permission to continue running my studio free of charge. The very next day, he comes to the house and absolutely loses it on her, saying she violated her contract, that she needs to find a new place to live, and that he's going to sue her. And the best part, he let me stay and let me keep my studio. Also, he used my services a few times for himself. That was effing brutal. Obviously, she didn't want you running the business because it could attract attention to the fact she was subletting. Hey guys, thank you all for watching. I'll see you in the next one.